The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William reviewed his packed schedule. Another day filled with royal duties, charity visits, and public appearances stretched ahead of him. But something felt different today. The weight of responsibility seemed heavier on his shoulders, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more than just ribbon cuttings and handshakes. William had always been driven by a desire to make a real difference in people's lives. Unlike many members of the royal family who were content with ceremonial roles, he wanted to get his hands dirty, to truly understand the struggles of ordinary people. This morning, as he sipped his tea and watched Kate playing with their children in the garden, he made a decision that would change everything. The idea had been brewing in his mind for weeks. He wanted to experience life as a regular person, without the protection of security details, without the comfort of palace walls, without anyone knowing who he was. He wanted to see firsthand how people really lived, what challenges they faced, and how he could better serve them through his charitable work. His private secretary had tried to talk him out of it. The idea was unprecedented, potentially dangerous, and certainly not something the palace would officially approve. But William was determined. He had already made arrangements to spend a week undercover, staying in a modest bed and breakfast in a working-class neighborhood in Manchester. He would use a false identity, dress like an ordinary citizen, and immerse himself completely in everyday life. Kate had been supportive but worried. She knew her husband's compassionate heart often led him into situations that others might consider risky. But she also understood his need to connect with people on a genuine level. She helped him prepare, choosing clothes from regular high street shops, practicing his accent to sound less posh, and even helping him create a believable backstory. The night before his departure, William lay awake thinking about what he might discover. He had grown up in privilege, attended the finest schools, and lived a life most people could only dream of. But he had also witnessed poverty and suffering through his charitable work. This journey would be different, though. This time, he wouldn't be Prince William visiting as a patron. He would be just another person trying to make ends meet. As dawn broke, William kissed Kate and the children goodbye, promising to call every evening. He had told them he was going on a research trip for his mental health charity, which wasn't entirely untrue. What he was about to experience would indeed teach him about the mental and emotional toll of financial hardship, job insecurity, and social isolation. Dressed in worn jeans, a simple sweater, and scuffed trainers, William looked nothing like the polished prince the public knew. He had practiced walking differently, talking differently, and even thinking differently about his place in the world. For the next week, he would be David Williams, a freelance writer researching a book about modern British society. The train journey to Manchester was his first real taste of ordinary life. He sat in a crowded carriage, listening to conversations about bills, job worries, and family struggles. No one gave him a second glance. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly anonymous, and the feeling was both liberating and terrifying. When he arrived at the small bed and breakfast, the elderly landlady, Mrs. Henderson, greeted him with suspicious eyes. She clearly wasn't impressed by his appearance or his story about being a writer. Her attitude was a sharp contrast to the deference he was used to receiving. It was his first lesson in how differently the world treated people based on their perceived status and wealth. His room was small, cramped, and smelled of old carpet and disinfectant. The single bed sagged in the middle, the radiator clanked throughout the night, and the shared bathroom down the hall was a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to. But William was determined to embrace every aspect of this experience. That first evening, as he sat in his uncomfortable bed writing in a journal he had brought to document his experiences, William realized he was already learning things that no amount of briefings or charity visits had taught him. The simple act of worrying about whether he had enough money for dinner tomorrow was a foreign concept that millions of people lived with every day. He thought about Kate, probably tucking the children into their comfortable beds at that very moment, and wondered what she would think of his Spartan surroundings. Little did he know that his decision to embark on this journey would soon uncover something that would shake their world to its very foundation. The adventure had begun, and Prince William had no idea that his simple desire to help and understand his future subjects would lead him down a path that would test everything he believed about justice, loyalty, and love. William's second day in Manchester began with a rude awakening. The alarm clock in his tiny room had stopped working sometime during the night, and he overslept. This small inconvenience, something he had never experienced at the palace where staff ensured everything ran perfectly, left him feeling disoriented and behind schedule. After a rushed breakfast of instant coffee and stale toast at a greasy spoon cafe, William began exploring the neighborhood. He had planned to observe quietly, maybe strike up casual conversations with locals, but fate had other plans. Walking past a community center, he noticed a commotion outside. A group of angry parents were arguing with a well-dressed man in an expensive suit who was clearly trying to leave. William's instinct was to keep walking, to avoid getting involved in other people's problems. But something about the desperation in the parents' voices made him pause. He moved closer, pretending to read a notice board while listening to their conversation. The man in the suit was apparently a government official responsible for closing down the community center due to budget cuts. The parents were pleading with him, explaining how the center provided after-school care for their children, meals for families who couldn't afford them, and support groups for people struggling with mental health issues. Without it, many families would have nowhere to turn. One mother, Sarah Mitchell, was particularly vocal. She held the hand of her young daughter while explaining how the center had been a lifeline when her husband lost his job 6 months ago. The free meals had kept her family fed, and the job search support had given her hope. Now, with just 2 weeks' notice, it would all disappear. William watched as the official dismissed their concerns with bureaucratic language about efficiency and necessary sacrifices. The cold indifference of the man's response reminded William of similar conversations he had overheard at palace meetings, where people's lives were reduced to statistics and budget lines. After the official left, William approached Sarah. He introduced himself as David and asked if there was anything he could do to help. Sarah looked at him skeptically at first, but something in his genuine concern seemed to convince her. She invited him to see the community center before it closed, to understand what they were losing. Walking through the center, William was struck by how much it resembled some of the charitable organizations he patronized, but on a much smaller, more intimate scale. Children were doing homework in one room while volunteers helped them. In another room, elderly people were playing cards and chatting, clearly finding companionship that many of them lacked at home. The kitchen was busy preparing meals that would be distributed to families in need. Sarah introduced him to James Morrison, the center's manager, who had been running the place for 15 years. James was clearly devastated by the closure, but was trying to stay positive for the sake of the people who depended on the center. He explained how they had appealed the decision, written letters to politicians, and even started a petition, but nothing had worked. As William listened to James's story, he learned something that made his blood run cold. The closure wasn't just about budget cuts. The land the community center sat on was valuable, and there were rumors that it would be sold to developers who wanted to build luxury apartments. The official who had dismissed the parents so coldly apparently had connections to the development company. William spent the rest of the day at the center, helping where he could and listening to stories from the people who used its services. He met Emma, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 part-time jobs but still struggled to put food on the table. He spoke with George, an elderly widower who came to the center every day because it was the only place where he felt less alone. He helped serve dinner to families who might not have eaten otherwise. That evening, back in his cramped room, William felt a mixture of anger and determination, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had always known that poverty and hardship existed, but seeing it up close without the buffer of royal protocol and prepared presentations was different. These weren't statistics or photo opportunities. These were real people with real struggles, and they were being failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. He called Kate, as promised, but found it difficult to explain what he was experiencing without revealing too much about where he was or what he was doing. He could hear the concern in her voice when he told her he was learning important things about how people really lived. She asked if he was safe, and he assured her he was, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. William lay awake that night, his mind racing with plans. He couldn't use his royal influence while undercover, but he was already thinking about what he could do once he returned to his official role. The problem was he was beginning to suspect that the corruption he had uncovered might reach higher than he initially thought. The next morning, William made a decision that would change the course of his investigation. He would stay longer than planned, and he would dig deeper into what was really happening with the community center closure. He had no idea that his amateur detective work was about to uncover a scandal that would shake the very foundations of the institutions he had been raised to respect and defend. As he prepared for another day of discovery, William realized that his simple desire to understand his future subjects had evolved into something much more serious. He was no longer just observing poverty and hardship. He was uncovering corruption and injustice, and he had no idea how far the rabbit hole would take him. William's third day began with an unexpected phone call from James Morrison. The community center manager sounded distressed and asked if they could meet privately. Something urgent had happened overnight, and James needed someone he could trust to talk to about it. They met at a small cafe several blocks away from the community center. James looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. He explained that he had received a threatening phone call in the middle of the night. A voice he didn't recognize had warned him to stop fighting the closure and to keep quiet about the real reasons behind it. The caller had mentioned specific details about James's daily routine, suggesting they had been watching him. William felt a chill run down his spine. What had started as his personal journey to understand ordinary people's lives had taken a dark turn. He encouraged James to go to the police, but the manager shook his head sadly. He had already tried that route months ago when he first suspected corruption in the closure decision. The police had been polite but ultimately unhelpful, claiming they couldn't investigate without concrete evidence. James then revealed something that made William's heart race. He had been quietly gathering that evidence. Over the past several months, he had documented meetings, recorded phone conversations where legally possible, and collected financial records that showed suspicious patterns. He had discovered that the community center closure was just one part of a larger scheme involving multiple properties across the city. The same development company that wanted the community center land had acquired several other public buildings in similar circumstances. Each time the buildings were closed due to claimed budget shortfalls, then sold at below-market prices to the developers. Local government officials were involved, and there appeared to be a network of people profiting from these deals while communities lost essential services. William listened with growing alarm as James showed him photocopied documents and recordings on his phone. The evidence was compelling, but William could also see why James was frightened. If these people were willing to make threatening phone calls, they might be capable of much worse. As they talked, William noticed a man in a dark jacket who seemed to be paying unusual attention to their conversation. The man had been sitting at a nearby table when they arrived, and he had been glancing their way repeatedly while pretending to read a newspaper. When William mentioned this to James, the manager's face went pale. They decided to leave separately, with James going first. William waited 10 minutes before heading back toward his bed and breakfast, taking a circuitous route to see if anyone was following him. His heart pounded as he realized this was no longer a simple research exercise. He was potentially in real danger, and he had no security detail to protect him. That afternoon, William made a decision that would have horrified his protection officers if they had known about it. He returned to the community center and spent hours helping James copy and organize all the evidence they had gathered. They made multiple copies of everything and discussed how to safely store them in different locations. Sarah Mitchell arrived while they were working and was shocked to see the documents spread across James's desk. When they explained what they had discovered, her anger was immediate and fierce. Her family wasn't just losing a community service because of budget cuts. They were losing it because corrupt officials were making money from their misery. Word spread quickly among the center's regular users about what was really happening. By evening, dozens of people had gathered to see the evidence for themselves. William watched as their shock turned to outrage, then to determination. These people had little money and limited political influence, but they weren't going to let corruption destroy their community without a fight. Emma, the single mother William had met the day before, stood up and addressed the group. Her voice shook with emotion as she talked about how the center had saved her family during their darkest times. She proposed that they organize a proper campaign to expose the corruption, not just save their community center, but protect other communities from the same fate. William found himself deeply moved by the courage of these ordinary people who were willing to stand up against powerful forces that had much more money and influence than they did. He offered to help with their campaign, using his claimed skills as a writer to help them prepare documents and press releases. As the meeting broke up, James pulled William aside. He had made a decision that would put him at even greater risk. He was going to contact an investigative journalist he knew at the Manchester Evening News. The reporter had been following stories about local government corruption for years and might be interested in this evidence. Walking back to his lodgings that night, William felt the weight of what he had stumbled into. He had come to Manchester to understand poverty and hardship, but he had discovered something much more sinister. A network of corruption that was systematically destroying communities for profit, and ordinary people who were fighting back despite the personal cost. He called Kate again, and this time he couldn't hide his troubled state of mind completely. He told her he had uncovered some disturbing things about how government services were being cut, but he couldn't provide details yet. Kate sensed something was seriously wrong and begged him to come home early. But William knew he couldn't abandon the people who were depending on him now. That night, as he lay in his narrow bed listening to the sounds of the city outside his window, William realized his life had changed forever. He could never again attend a charity, function, or cut a ribbon without thinking about James, Morrison, and Sarah Mitchell, and all the others who were fighting battles that the powerful preferred to keep hidden. Tomorrow he would meet with the journalist, and there would be no turning back from whatever consequences that meeting might bring. The meeting with investigative journalist Rebecca Hayes took place in a crowded shopping center, deliberately chosen for its anonymity. Rebecca was a seasoned reporter in her 40s who had spent years investigating local government corruption. When James introduced William as David Williams, a freelance writer who had become involved in the community center case, Rebecca studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than William was comfortable with. James presented the evidence they had gathered, and Rebecca's expression grew increasingly serious as she reviewed the documents. She had suspected something like this was happening, but had never been able to gather enough proof. The pattern James had identified across multiple properties was exactly what she had been looking for to build a comprehensive story. Rebecca explained that this type of corruption was more common than people realized. Public assets were systematically being transferred to private developers through a network of officials who received financial benefits in return. The community center case was particularly egregious because it involved services that vulnerable people depended on for survival. What Rebecca revealed next sent chills through William's body. She had been investigating this network for over 2 years and had discovered connections that reached much higher than local government. Some of the developers involved had ties to major political figures, and there were indications that similar schemes were operating in cities across the country. The journalist looked directly at William when she said this, and he had the unsettling feeling that she suspected he was more than just a freelance writer researching a book. Her questions became more pointed, asking about his background and how he had become so quickly involved in such a complex situation. Rebecca agreed to investigate their evidence thoroughly, but she warned them that publishing such a story would likely trigger a fierce response from the people involved. They should be prepared for intimidation tactics, legal threats, and attempts to discredit their claims. She advised them to be extremely careful about their personal safety. After the meeting, William walked through Manchester City Centre feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just about one community center or even one city. It was a systematic attack on public services that affected millions of people across the country, and now he was personally involved in exposing it. His phone rang as he sat on a bench in a small park, trying to process everything he had learned. It was Kate, and the worry in her voice was unmistakable. She had been trying to reach him for hours, and when he hadn't answered, she had started to panic. William realized he had been so absorbed in the day's events that he had forgotten to check his phone. Kate told him something that made his blood freeze. She had received a phone call at Kensington Palace that morning from someone claiming to be investigating David Williams for suspected terrorist activities. The caller had asked specific questions about Williams' whereabouts and had mentioned details about his trip to Manchester that should have been known only to them. William's mind raced as he tried to understand how anyone could have discovered his real identity or connected him to his undercover persona. He had been so careful about maintaining his false identity, but somehow his cover had been blown. The implications were terrifying, not just for him but for Kate and their children. Kate begged him to come home immediately, but William found himself torn between his responsibility to his family and his commitment to the people who were counting on him to help expose the corruption. James Morrison had risked everything to gather evidence, and Sarah Mitchell and the others were depending on that evidence to save their community. That evening, William met secretly with James to warn him that their investigation might have been discovered. James wasn't surprised by the news. He had noticed increased surveillance around his home and the community center, and several people had mentioned seeing unfamiliar faces asking questions about the closure campaign. They made a difficult decision. Instead of backing down, they would accelerate their timeline. Rebecca Hayes would be given exclusive access to all their evidence immediately, with the understanding that she would publish her story as quickly as possible. Once the information was public, it would be harder for the corrupt network to silence them through intimidation. James also revealed that he had taken an additional precaution. He had sent copies of all their evidence to several trusted contacts with instructions to make the information public if anything happened to him or if he disappeared. It was a sobering reminder of how dangerous their situation had become. William spent a sleepless night weighing his options. He could return to London immediately and use his royal influence to investigate the corruption through official channels, but he knew that approach would likely take months or years, during which time more communities would suffer and evidence might disappear. Alternatively, he could stay and see their grassroots investigation through to its conclusion, but that would put both him and his family at increasing risk. The people who had threatened James wouldn't hesitate to target a member of the royal family if they felt their interests were threatened. As dawn broke over Manchester, William made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would stay and fight, but he would also take steps to protect his family. He called his private secretary using an encrypted phone and arranged for additional security for Kate and the children. Though he couldn't explain the specific reasons for his request, he also made another call that would shock the palace hierarchy. He contacted a trusted friend who worked in the Metropolitan Police's Specialized Crimes Unit and arranged to share their evidence through unofficial channels. If something happened to him or to James, there would be people in law enforcement who knew about the corruption and could continue the investigation. William realized he was no longer just Prince William trying to understand his future subjects. He had become David Williams, an ordinary citizen fighting for justice alongside people who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. The transformation was complete, and there was no going back. Today would bring the most dangerous phase of their investigation, and William had no idea whether he would survive it with his identity, his safety, or his family intact. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Rebecca Hayes called James at dawn with information that left them all reeling. Her preliminary investigation into the evidence they had provided had uncovered something much bigger than they had imagined. The corruption network didn't just involve local officials and developers. It reached into the highest levels of government, including members of parliament and civil servants in multiple departments. More shocking still, Rebecca had discovered that some of the money being made from these corrupt deals was being funneled into offshore accounts that appeared to be connected to organized crime. What had started as a story about local government corruption had become an investigation into money laundering and criminal conspiracy on a national scale. William met with James and Rebecca at a different location, a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Manchester, where they were unlikely to be recognized or overheard. The journalists spread copies of financial documents across their table, pointing out patterns that showed how money from property deals was being moved through shell companies and foreign banks. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over the past 5 years, public assets worth hundreds of millions of pounds had been sold to private developers at prices far below their market value. The difference between the real value and the sale price was being split between corrupt officials and criminal organizations that provided the initial capital for the deals. Rebecca explained that breaking this story would likely trigger investigations by multiple law enforcement agencies and could potentially bring down government ministers, but it would also put everyone involved in extreme danger. The people behind this operation had too much money and power to lose to allow a few concerned citizens to expose them without consequences. As they talked, William noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A man at a corner table was taking photographs of them with a long lens camera, trying to be discreet but not succeeding completely. When William pointed this out, Rebecca immediately gathered up the documents and suggested they leave separately through different exits. Outside the diner, William found his hands shaking as he walked to his car. The reality of what they were up against was finally sinking in completely. These weren't just corrupt local officials who might threaten or intimidate their opponents. They were dealing with people who had connections to organized crime and unlimited resources to protect their interests. His phone buzzed with a text message from Kate that made his blood run cold. Someone had attempted to break into Kensington Palace the night before. Security had caught the intruder before they gained access to the family quarters, but the incident had left Kate terrified, and the children asking questions about why there were suddenly more guards around them. William realized that staying in Manchester was no longer just putting himself at risk. His investigation was endangering his family, and he couldn't continue without considering their safety above everything else. But he also knew that abandoning the investigation now would doom James Morrison and the community center supporters to possible retaliation without any protection. He made a desperate decision. He would reveal his true identity to Rebecca Hayes and ask for her help in protecting the people who had trusted him. It was a massive risk that could destroy his reputation and create a constitutional crisis, but he couldn't see any other way to ensure everyone's safety. William met Rebecca alone that afternoon and told her the truth about who he was. The journalist's reaction was everything he had feared. She was shocked, angry at being deceived, and immediately concerned about the legal and ethical implications of a member of the royal family being involved in her investigation. But Rebecca was also a professional who understood the significance of what William had uncovered. A future king had personally witnessed corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. His testimony and involvement could provide the credibility and protection that the investigation needed to succeed. Together, they developed a plan that would protect everyone involved while ensuring the story could be published safely. William would return to London immediately and begin working through official channels to launch investigations into the corruption network. Rebecca would delay publishing her story until William had time to arrange protection for James Morrison and the other community activists. Most importantly, William would use his position to ensure that the community center and other threatened facilities received emergency funding to prevent their closure while the investigations proceeded. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best way to protect vulnerable people while pursuing justice. That evening, as William prepared to leave Manchester, he met one final time with James Morrison and Sarah Mitchell. He couldn't tell them his real identity, but he assured them that their evidence would reach people with the power to act on it. He promised that their community center would be saved and that the people responsible for the corruption would be held accountable. Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes and said something that would stay with William for the rest of his life. She told him that in her experience, people with power rarely kept their promises to people without it. But something about David Williams made her believe that this time might be different. As William drove away from Manchester, he carried with him not just evidence of corruption, but a profound understanding of what it meant to fight for justice when you had everything to lose. The ordinary people he had met had changed him forever, and he was determined to use his extraordinary position to change their world in return. The hardest part of his journey was still ahead. He would have to explain to Kate, to the palace, and eventually to the public what he had done and why. The consequences of his decision to go undercover would ripple through the monarchy and the government for years to come. But as he drove through the night toward London, William felt something he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to serve his people, not as their future king, but as their fellow citizen in the fight for justice. William arrived at Kensington Palace in the early hours of the morning, to find Kate waiting for him in their private sitting room. She had been unable to sleep, consumed with worry about his safety and the strange events that had surrounded his absence. When she saw his exhausted face and rumpled clothes, she knew immediately that something profound had happened during his time away. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of their marriage. William had to explain not just what he had discovered in Manchester, but why he had put himself and their family at risk by going undercover without proper security. Kate listened with growing alarm as he described the corruption network, the threats against James Morrison, and the attempted break-in at the palace. Kate's reaction was complex and emotional. She was proud of William's compassion and his desire to truly understand the struggles of ordinary people, but she was also angry that he had made such a dangerous decision without consulting her fully, and terrified about what the consequences might be for their family and the monarchy itself. The immediate priority was ensuring their children's safety while William figured out how to proceed with the explosive information he had gathered. Additional security measures were quietly implemented, and the children were kept closer to home. While William and Kate decided how to handle the situation, William's next challenge was briefing his private secretary and the palace's senior advisors about what had happened. The meeting took place in the palace's most secure conference room, with only a handful of the most trusted staff members present. The reaction around the table ranged from shock to horror, to admiration for William's courage in uncovering such serious corruption. The constitutional implications were staggering. A future king had personally gathered evidence of criminal activity involving government officials. There were questions about whether William's undercover activities were legal, whether the evidence he had helped gather would be admissible in court, and how the monarchy should respond to discovering corruption at the highest levels of government. The palace's legal advisors worked around the clock to determine the best way forward. They concluded that William's actions, while unprecedented and risky, were not illegal since he had been acting as a private citizen rather than in his official royal capacity. The evidence he had helped gather could potentially be used in criminal investigations, provided it was handled through proper legal channels. Meanwhile, Rebecca Hayes was conducting her own investigation in Manchester, following up on the leads William had provided while respecting their agreement to delay publication. She discovered even more evidence of the corruption network's activities, including recorded conversations and financial documents that clearly showed criminal conspiracy. The breakthrough came when Rebecca's investigation led her to a former government official who had been forced out of his job for refusing to participate in the corrupt schemes. Dr. Marcus Webb had been a senior civil servant in the Department for Communities and Local Government who had tried to blow the whistle on the property deals 2 years earlier. Dr. Webb had been discredited and forced into early retirement when he tried to expose the corruption through official channels. But he had kept copies of all the evidence he had gathered, including emails and meeting minutes that proved senior ministers knew about and approved the corrupt deals. When Rebecca contacted Dr. Webb and showed him the evidence William and James had gathered, the former official realized that he finally had the corroboration he needed to make his case. Together, they had enough evidence to prove criminal conspiracy involving dozens of officials and millions of pounds in stolen public assets. William made the decision to meet secretly with Dr. Webb, using his royal influence to arrange a secure location for their conversation. The meeting took place at a safe house operated by the Metropolitan Police, with senior detectives present to ensure the evidence was properly documented. Dr. Webb's story confirmed William's worst fears about the scope of the corruption. The network involved not just local officials but ministers in the current government who had been systematically looting public assets for years. The money being stolen was supposed to fund essential services like the community center in Manchester, but instead it was flowing into private accounts. More disturbing still, Dr. Webb revealed that when he had tried to expose the corruption through proper channels, he had been threatened not just with the loss of his job, but with physical harm to his family. The people behind the scheme had connections to criminal organizations that were willing to use violence to protect their interests. William realized that his decision to get involved had put not just himself and his family at risk, but everyone who had helped him gather evidence. James Morrison, Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca Hayes, and Dr. Webb were all now targets of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and violence. The weight of responsibility was crushing. William had started his journey to Manchester with the simple goal of understanding how ordinary people lived. Now he found himself at the center of a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the government and the safety of everyone who had trusted him. Kate found him that evening sitting alone in their garden, staring at the stars and trying to process the magnitude of what he had uncovered. She sat beside him without speaking, offering the comfort of her presence while he struggled with the decision that would define the rest of his life. William had to choose between protecting his family and the monarchy by staying silent about what he had discovered, or using his position to ensure that justice was done regardless of the personal cost. It was a choice that would determine not just his own future, but the future of everyone who had fought alongside him for truth and justice. The next day would bring the moment when William would have to reveal everything to the highest levels of government and law enforcement. There would be no going back from whatever consequences that decision might bring. But William knew he could no longer live with the knowledge that his silence was allowing corruption and injustice to continue. The meeting that would change everything took place in the most secure room at Scotland Yard, with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the Director of the Serious Fraud Office, and the Cabinet Secretary present. William had insisted that Kate be allowed to attend, understanding that the decisions made in this room would affect their entire family. As William presented the evidence he had helped gather, the shocked silence around the table grew heavier with each revelation. Financial documents, recorded conversations, and witness statements painted a picture of corruption that reached into the heart of the British government. 3 serving ministers and dozens of civil servants were implicated in criminal conspiracy involving hundreds of millions of pounds. The Cabinet Secretary, Sir David Richardson, was the first to speak after William finished his presentation. His face was pale as he acknowledged that the evidence appeared to be genuine and that the implications for the government were catastrophic. Several of the implicated ministers were close allies of the Prime Minister, and their involvement would likely bring down the entire administration. Commissioner Sandra Hughes of the Metropolitan Police explained that the evidence was strong enough to launch immediate criminal investigations, but she warned that arresting serving government ministers would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything Britain had experienced in modern times. The monarchy's involvement in exposing the corruption would only add to the complexity of the situation. Kate spoke for the first time during the meeting, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. She reminded everyone present that while the political implications were serious, the real victims were people like James Morrison and Sarah Mitchell, who had lost essential services because of criminal greed. Justice for them had to take priority over political convenience. Director of the Serious Fraud Office Margaret Stone outlined the legal process that would follow. Simultaneous raids would be conducted on the homes and offices of all the implicated officials, with arrests made based on the evidence William had helped provide. The investigation would likely take years to complete, but the initial charges could be filed within days. The most difficult moment of the meeting came when Sir David Richardson asked William directly whether he was prepared for the personal consequences of his actions. Once the arrests were made public, William's role in exposing the corruption would inevitably become known. The media scrutiny would be intense, and there would be attempts to discredit him and his evidence. William looked at Kate, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Before answering that, he was prepared to face whatever consequences came from doing what he believed was right. He had witnessed firsthand how corruption destroyed communities and hurt vulnerable people, and he could not remain silent about what he had discovered. The operation began that same evening. Police teams across the country executed search warrants simultaneously, seizing computers, financial records, and communications equipment from dozens of locations. By morning, 15 people had been arrested, including 2 government ministers who were taken into custody as they arrived at their offices in Whitehall. The news broke just as William and Kate were having breakfast with their children. The BBC's breaking news bulletin described the arrests as the largest government corruption investigation in British history, though William's involvement was not yet public knowledge. Kate reached across the table and squeezed his hand as they both realized there was no going back now. James Morrison called William's phone that afternoon, his voice filled with emotion as he thanked David Williams for keeping his promise. The community center had received emergency funding to remain open, and James had been told that the investigation would ensure similar closures could not happen in the future. For the first time in months, James sounded hopeful about the future. Rebecca Hayes published her comprehensive investigation 3 days later, revealing the full scope of the corruption network and its impact on communities across the country. Her story won numerous journalism awards and sparked parliamentary inquiries that led to sweeping reforms in how public assets were managed and sold. The revelation of William's involvement came 2 weeks later, when a leaked government document revealed that His Royal Highness had been the source of crucial evidence in the corruption investigation. The media response was explosive, with some outlets praising William's courage and others questioning whether a future king should involve himself in such controversial matters. Kate stood by William throughout the media storm, appearing with him at public events and making it clear that she supported his decision to fight for justice. Their marriage, tested by the stress and danger of the investigation, emerged stronger than ever. They had faced the ultimate test of their values and found that they were truly united in their commitment to serving others. The trials that followed resulted in dozens of convictions and prison sentences, totaling over 200 years. Hundreds of millions of pounds in stolen public assets were recovered and returned to the communities that had been robbed. The community centre in Manchester became a symbol of what could be achieved when ordinary people stood up against corruption and powerful allies supported their fight. 5 years later, William and Kate returned to Manchester to officially open a new wing of the community centre, funded with money recovered from the corruption investigation. James Morrison, now the centre's director, introduced them to Sarah Mitchell's daughter, who had graduated from university and returned to work in the community that had supported her family during their darkest times. As William cut the ribbon and watched children playing in the center's new playground, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he decided he wanted to truly understand how his future subjects lived. He had learned that being a prince meant more than ceremonies and public appearances. It meant standing with people in their struggles for justice, regardless of the personal cost. Kate found him standing quietly in the center's memorial garden, where a plaque honored all those who had fought against corruption to protect their community. She smiled as she watched him interact with the children and families who still used the center's services daily, knowing that her husband had found his true calling not in royal protocol, but in the simple act of helping others fight for what was right. The boy who had grown up in palaces had become a man who understood that real nobility came not from titles or crowns, but from having the courage to stand up for justice when everything you valued was at stake. And Kate, who had supported him through the most dangerous and difficult period of their lives, knew that their love had been tested in the crucible of conscience and had emerged unbreakable.